Hello and welcome to the Womb Centered Healing Podcast. I'm Sama Morningstar and I have Sabrina here with me today. Thank you so much, Sabrina, for joining me again. I really loved our conversation recently. Sabrina was a guest in the Herbal Womb Wellness Speaker Series, and I knew I wanted to talk with you more when we were talking there. The conversation just flew by way too fast. And so I'm so glad that we had this time set aside. And I know that we actually participated in a conversation that led to making this appointment around whether or not we were breastfed as babies, as infants, and and the processes we might have gone through to realize the effect that had on our lives and the healing processes to remedy any detrimental effects that had. And I'd love to hear your story around that. So please introduce yourself and share with us about that, about how your personal breastfeeding journey as an infant has influenced your life.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Sam. I appreciate being here. My name is Sabrina Ourania, and I am a menstrual fertility and reproductive health practitioner. I mostly work with women around issues with menstruation, wanting to connect more deeply with their womb space, and that all kind of comes from my own journey as it relates to healing wounds around the feminine and around my relationship with my mother and my whole, maternal family line. And, as much as that work kind of seems to be really centralized around womb health, menstruation, reproduction, there's a lot more that goes into it. And it really is just about, having felt throughout my life a disconnection and a cutoff from the feminine and becoming a seeker of that pretty early on, and to try to repair that damage and to close the circle really and bring it back all together. So, as it relates to the breastfeeding question, that was one of the things that I knew early on about my early childhood experiences, was both that my mom had a very challenging birth and labor with me, and led to a lot of very kind of complex feelings in our relationship dynamic right off the get-go. And then she had tried breastfeeding with me initially, and pretty quickly after that, I was diagnosed with colic. And, at that time, this was 1986 that I was born, there was a lot of popularity around soy formulas. There was kind of a lot of hype around, now women don't have to breastfeed because we want to support these women in their careers, and breastfeeding can really take you off that track. And so although there was a lot of movement toward supporting women in careers and liberation, there was also kind of very quick to prescribe that to women to put their babies on formulas. And so, rather than the doctor, as I would have liked to see, right, or we hope that today they would have some, other suggestions like dietary changes the mother could make, or other things that could be done to support, my colic, the quality of her milk, and our interaction, knowing that there's other benefits aside from just the basic nutrition that I'm getting from the milk. They prescribed a soy-based formula for me, and that's what I was on for the next several years.
So did this eliminate the colic?
That's a good question. I don't know that we could say it eliminated the colic. My mom said that the amount of crying and the pain that it seemed like I was in went down, but I did continue to have digestive struggles for a lot of my childhood. And probably in my teen years and my early adulthood, and this is something I think we can dig into more, a lot of the healing work that I was doing in terms of physical repairing of having lacked the breast milk, I think was around healing my gut. And so, it was kind of ongoing. There was quite a lot of digestive issues. One that I think is interesting that, may or may not have a connection here. And it's hard to know what all the factors are that tie into it. But kind of an unusual thing about my childhood is that I was actually very afraid to go to the bathroom, and specifically number 2, I had a lot of fear around it. And it probably was from extreme constipation that was happening, which I think may have also resulted from being on a soy-based formula. So, it's just kind of interesting how it could have maybe filtered into a lot of different challenges that I faced with my health when I was young.
I wonder what comes first, the fear of going to the bathroom or the constipation that produced the fear that produces more fear. I mean, it's kind of hard to say where it all started because we talk about breastfeeding being the best way to develop healthy digestion. And yet, if the mother is eating something that is, or having an emotional something that is causing her milk to be an irritant to the baby. So, and please fill in where you might know more about this. But just in my understanding that sometimes there's certain foods that might be very common for moms to be eating and not knowing that are very commonly discovered to be the cause of a colicky baby's digestive distress. Foods like garlic is one. I imagine brassicas like broccoli,
cauliflower,
cabbage that are considered to be healthy foods in general, and staple foods even. I mean, I know we eat broccoli and kale and cauliflower, every week, if not every day in my household. And then a garlic too is considered, I mean, how many recipe books, the first step of every single recipe is to chop up your onions and your garlic and stir fry them in the oil, and then you add your stuff. That's the basic staple foods. And then of course, cayenne pepper and chili pepper. And so, and then, I mean, I'm sure you have other, maybe you have other, a longer list of foods that you've learned about now that moms can be advised to see what happens to their baby's digestive health if they eliminate those from their diet. And lactation consultants would have this information, whereas medical doctors, especially at that time when it wasn't just the cultural thing of moms wanting to get back to work and be included in the workforce and be empowered in that way. That whole approach was influenced by the baby formula companies in the first place. The baby formula companies were instrumental in, and are still instrumental in the information, in providing the information that's given to doctors. And they fund the educational programs in the medical schools for doctors. And so proper information about breastfeeding is eliminated from medical schools, is not included in medical schools deliberately, because the baby formula companies
have a stake in it. Yeah.
Have a stake in it. Make more money from doctors being underinformed about breastfeeding and not having good information or complete information to offer their patients, their new moms, about breastfeeding. And just and oftentimes the baby formula companies are giving doctors special perks to promote their specific formula for moms, and giving them all the reasons, lists of reasons why they should recommend this formula. Oh, the baby has colic. Oh, the mom wants to go back to work. They've got this exhaustive list, I'm sure, in their propaganda materials about why doctors should just go ahead and recommend their baby formula and not support moms to try harder at breastfeeding, right? And so it's not just the empower women to go back to work, and it's like this whole other thing. And that was happening. The baby formula companies were doing that long before it was the empower mothers to go back to work narrative. My grandmother and my mother were being taught that it was because breastfeeding was shameful and disgusting back then.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, you and I both know that this goes beyond just breastfeeding, that this is something that is, insidious in how the medical industry works, because they do get these perks and these payoffs from these different pharmaceutical companies or formula makers or whatever. But it also shows the way it's so easy for some, political agendas that may be very progressive and supportive of women to be sort of co-opted and used as propaganda material, like you said, because of course we do want to support women in the workforce to be liberated and provide for themselves, not be solely dependent upon, the father or the head of the household's financial stability or whatever. I mean, that was a very important development, and at the same time, how easily that could just be used to fuel all the marketing around this as well. And, unfortunately, women, in this position, and I know because this is my first pregnancy. I'm 8 months pregnant right now. And I'm in a sort of very vulnerable position in the sense that I'm about to have a newborn. I've never had a newborn, and the baby is crying and I don't, I have my intuitions about what things mean. But when, you have a newborn child suffering and no personal experience with how to engage with that and what to do, you really are looking for doctors or support from experts in their field to help you figure this out, and it can be a place where there's a lot of fear and anxiety that comes up for new mothers, so they're an extra vulnerable population to being kind of used and abused in this way through this kind of marketing and propaganda, as you said. So,
yeah. And unfortunately, it's very easy for doctors to say, and this still goes on today, for doctors to tell moms, oh, you're not producing enough milk, your baby's going to starve, instead of, and say fear-inducing things, tell the mother fear-inducing things, instead of, doctors have got to be aware that there are lactation professionals that are available. Even if they don't have the information themselves, they've got to be aware that there are people there. I mean, they come into the hospital, lactation professionals come into the hospital when patients are in the hospital after, postpartum, and they help moms with their new babies. Any doctor who's paying attention knows that instead of saying, oh, your baby's not getting enough milk in the postpartum visits, they could say instead, let's get you in touch with a lactation consultant and help this process along. But there's so many societal influences and propaganda influences that are keeping those doctors in that lane of oh, just get the baby on formula and everyone will be better off, So anyway, back to your we could go on.
No, totally. I mean, this is important stuff to talk about. I'm right there with you. I mean, this is why I think alternative and complementary medicine is so important, but why we need to really be able to bridge that gap, because it is true that the way the medical system is set up, these doctors don't necessarily have the kind of time to really sit with their clients to talk about diet and do all of this, just sort of by the nature of how their whole setup and their scheduling really goes, and so to have to be partnered with lactation consultant, wellness health professionals, women who maybe focus on alternative or herbal remedies, and have a referral, connection between these physicians and these other people who work in these alternative fields would be so advantageous,
Yeah. So, and I know there are people working on that of getting integrative medicine systems set up, but it's not available for everyone, which is unfortunate. But we're just in this transitional phase. One of my mentors helped to establish integrative medicine programs in over 100 medical schools in the United States, because she went to medical school after already having studied herbalism and midwifery for quite a number of years, and decided to go back to medical school, and was appalled at Yale at how misinformed and underrepresented the integrative medicine approaches were that she knew worked really well, from her experience.
Ram, perchance?
Yeah, it is a Viva Ram.
Yeah. I mean, because I'm a big fan of her too, and I think it's uncommon that people take that route, but for her to have had that particular perspective coming into that to the medical institution with the experience that she already had, I think she has a lot to say on that. So
and she's done some great work at advocating for doctors to be better informed and to be educated about integrative medicine options. So I'm rooting for her, and she does it. Like, she takes care of it. She does it, like she implemented this whole program in the medical schools while completing her medical degree at Yale University. I mean, she's
Yeah,
a very high functioning person.
totally.
And, but so back to your healing process around this. So, you were talking about realizing as you were an adult and you were struggling with your own health and well-being, at a certain point, you realized that your digestion was at the root of most of it, right? And I'm speaking from my own, you didn't say this, but I'm assuming this because of my own personal experience.
Yeah.
Hear that getting ready to come out of your mouth.
Yeah, yeah. I would say what I was experiencing that I later came to realize all sort of rested on the digestion was in my childhood. I dealt with getting sick quite frequently, and of course we were put on antibiotics pretty regularly. So in many ways, kind of compounding that problem of really lacking a healthy gut biome that would have supported me in having a stronger immune system. Instead, it kind of continued to be made worse by being on antibiotics a lot. I also suffered from a lot of allergies as a child. It was like seasonal, as well as like all kinds of different, different plants I had issues with, different animals I had issues with. And, for a while, my mom had gotten me on allergy shots. And then we were also testing me for, food allergies and stuff as well. And it's almost just kind of ironic thinking about it now, because some of the food allergies that I was being tested for were actually like preservatives and additives and color dyes in food. And they were saying, oh, she's allergic, and looking back on it, I'm like, this is crazy. These are all toxins, and some of them are neurotoxins. I have a very big sensitivity to MSG, and it's just interesting because what I think all of that ultimately says is that kind of the fact that I was sort of a bit of a canary for a lot of things that maybe a lot of children were eating regularly, but didn't immediately show symptoms of having an issue with in the way that I did, I think it is a really good example of, what can happen when you have a really dysfunctional gut situation, is that you become so much more sensitive to so many things. And I like to think of it as a blessing, because if I wasn't so sensitive, we wouldn't have started looking into it and addressing it. And it wouldn't have been such a priority in my life to start to do this healing. It could have been something that, over years compounds, and then you have a very chronic or serious health issue. But for me, it was kind of like, just having a little MSG, or just eating, drinking a soda that had sodium benzoate in it or something like that, immediately produced results that made me very ill. And it was, and I think, yeah, that the foundation of that was, gut dysbiosis was, what we call leaky gut syndrome, but just having a lot of inflammation going on in my gut that was allowing for a lot of things to pass through, the lining of my digestion and interfere with my immune system and just create a lot of reactivity in my body. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And as in the line of work that you are in, supporting new moms and pregnancy and birth, it's easy when we, at some point, you and I both recognize the importance of those early moments in our lives. Mm-hmm. And those early experiences with breastfeeding, and not only on the physical level, but also on the emotional level. I heard you talk about that in your story, and the inflammation can be not just a physiological response, but also an emotional response that affects the physiological response, and vice versa. The physiological response affects the emotional response. And so, the part of your story where you talked about your mother having some challenges during childbirth that set up a complex emotional dynamic between the two of you as an infant, and that you feel that contributed to the colic, that it sounds like that dynamic set up some emotional patterns in you, and then the whole not having a harmonious breastfeeding experience and then being on formula then exacerbated that by limiting the possibility of developing a healthy digestive system. And so as we look back on that, you know, as you're recognizing, wow, I'm so sensitive, all these problems after that, all the allergies, all the inflammation, all of the sensitivities to all of these things over the course of your life, at a certain point, you say, okay, I need to get to the bottom of this, and I need to start healing this. And usually where we really start to make some headway and start to see some healing happening is when we're addressing not just the physiology with food, dietary changes or herbal medicines or whatever it is, but also the emotional side of things, where we're addressing that original wounding of having a disruption to the essential connection with our mother, the one who's supposed to be taking care of us, and whatever emotional response that brings up for an infant whose mother's having a hard time connecting with the baby and having a complexity of feelings about now being a new mom. So I'd love to hear you talk about that more, and what kinds of healing processes really started to help you unravel all of that, you know, on top of, I'm sure and I'd love to hear about the dietary change and the physiological stuff, but then, you know, how it all comes together, you know, because people say all the time they've tried everything, but they haven't tried necessarily the right combination and addressed all aspects of it, right? They might have tried everything physiologically, but they haven't necessarily seen and addressed the emotional side of things. So
Yeah. No, that's such a good point, because I think we can't fix everything whatever that means, but just on a physical level, because if there is a, you know, disruption in the, you know, the emotional, the subtle energetic, you know, in our connection to, you know, our mother wound, whether it's that or just our own connection to our innate femininity and how we approach that in life, like whether that issue gets settled or not, there will be other things that are going to come up kind of within that patterning, until we're able to address it on some of these more sort of subtle levels. So yeah, you know, it's interesting. I didn't realize, even as I was doing all this healing around my gut, and that was a big focus of my life in like my early 20s, I didn't realize still how much of this really rested on my connection with my mother, having really been wounded from not having, you know, even just the simplicity of like that time we would have been spending together, you know, in that connection of nursing. And also seeing, you know, because it's interesting when you begin to look at like some of the negative effects of not breastfeeding, like if you just did a Google search for it, you're mostly going to see what the challenges are for the mother, both around, you know, feelings of trauma and shame for not being able to breastfeed successfully, and what that can do for them. But you know, you don't always necessarily see a lot of people speaking out about how that disrupts on more of an emotional level with the infant as well. But you know, there's this important oxytocin exchange going on between mother and baby during this time, you know, and so, you know, breastfeeding can contribute in the mother's part to having some serious postpartum depression, which can continue on. And so much of my childhood, my mom actually struggled with a lot of depression. And I don't believe that it began with the postpartum, but I definitely think that didn't help with it. And then when my sister came around, it was the same thing. She didn't breastfeed with her. So, you know, I see the ways in which, you know, our lack of that kind of base bonding initially, you know, brought up a lot of feelings for me around, you know, it's interesting, the archetype of Athena, you know, the Greek goddess who was supposedly born from Zeus, her father's head, and in many ways sort of denied having a mother, even though, you know, in earlier stories she did sort of have one, but she was sort of the woman who really embodied masculine principles. That's very much how I saw myself in my youth. And I remember seeing my mom as being this very depressed character, and in many ways I felt like very ineffectual, and I really idealized my father, and I idealized the masculine a lot throughout my life. And it's been a process in many different ways, just in terms of doing my womb healing work, in terms of connecting with the feminine within me, in terms of that coming up in partnerships, and then doing a lot of healing work with my mother. And I think we're at an interesting new stage of that now as I'm preparing for motherhood. It's brought us a whole lot closer as well. in a way that I see as an ongoing process of healing between us. Because it's not just like, you know, you check off some boxes. Okay, we did counseling together, you know, or we did X, Y, and Z kind of experiences together that was healing, and we're all good and done. You know, it's an ongoing process. And as I know that I do this healing work with myself and for my child coming into this world, I know that I'm actually offering that healing to my mother as well, and what she was lacking and the tools that she didn't have and that wasn't passed on to her from her mother as well, you know? So there's a lot of different pieces that go into it. One of the things that comes up for me right now, and what I think was a major realization for me around the breastfeeding and how I felt like this tied into it. Because like I said, I didn't know that these digestive issues I was having, I didn't know that my sort of aligning with my father more in my childhood, like I didn't see how all these pieces were connected until much later. But I would say the first time I really kind of had some kind of an inkling at how critical that breastfeeding piece was is, I want to say it was about 24, 25. I started studying shamanic journeying, drum journeying, with a practitioner who'd been sort of also a maternal figure for me. In many ways, I kind of had accidentally collected a lot of maternal figures in my life, women who I did see kind of more of that nurturing instinct, and who were maybe aware in some capacity through their own, you know, connection to that I was lacking it in some way. And so a lot of like friends' mothers were very much that way with me. And so this is one figure who, she led a monthly women's new moon ceremony that I joined when I was young through a best friend's mother. And so I naturally found myself in circles with these very maternal women as a way to kind of get what I felt like in some way had been lacking. And so I started doing this training with her around shamanic journeying. And it was, you know, one of the first couple times I ever did any of these drum-induced journeys. So if people aren't aware of what that is, but it's a very simple, rhythmic, trance-inducing drum beat. And you're laying down, you're relaxing, you begin to let your unconscious mind kind of come to the fore and take you on a journey. And it's essentially a vision quest that you can go on. And I found myself in one, it was like within the first couple ones I'd ever done, I found myself walking along this beach at night. And my ancestry is Greek. And so it felt very clear to me that I was like some Greek island or coastline or somewhere. And it's very starry night. I'm just walking along this beach, and I encountered this woman, and I just knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that she was like an ancient ancestor of mine. And she was so like just voluptuous and radiant. And she led me into this lit cave in the side of the mountain here by the coast. And as we entered into the cave, she just sat me down and held me against her like I was a child. But in the vision, I was my own age, you know, I was in my mid-20s. And she just began to let me nurse and suckle at her breast. And that went on for a while. And it was so replenishing and so moving. I remember coming out of that journey and just having a big emotional release and being like, wow, that was something even just talking about it right now, I just got some goosebumps, because it was like, I didn't know that was missing, just that connection, that feeling. And so it ended up being kind of a healing practice for me in my meditations for a while, to visualize breastfeeding with this figure of mine, this ancient ancestor, you know, and to kind of feel like I was receiving that from the mother, the mother archetype. I was receiving that from my lineage in a way that I felt like I had been denied. And I just sort of let that, whenever that vision wanted to come up or come through, or I was called to sit with that, I'd go there a lot, to that beach and that space. So it's sort of like doing the psychic breastfeeding, so to speak, you know, and that was a practice for a little while for me. Yeah.
Wow, this sounds like such a powerful practice that I feel could be healing for so many people that missed that, because there's and I've certainly engaged in that, in similar practices of, you know, where that imagery of me suckling Divine Mother, if you will, or comes up in poetry or in whatever kind of journey, you know, I call it visionary healing, guided visualization, that kind of thing, feels so nourishing and replenishing, like you say. And I include that in some of the programs and remothering practices that we do in my biomystical womb healing program, apprenticeship program too. And it just feels like it could be a whole program in and of itself where, you know, for whatever period of time people want to engage in that, to just give the body, give our spirit, give our emotional body that time that we might have missed. It sounds so powerful. It seems like a fundamental practice that's been central for your healing around this.
Yeah, definitely. And not anything, I feel like if someone had told me about it maybe, or tried to guide me through it, you know, I would have maybe been unsure or not really. It was the fact that it kind of spontaneously happened to me, you know, through this vision, and then feeling it so viscerally and how good that was for me that I wanted to continue to, you know, engage with that. You know, there's other interesting things that I'm thinking about too that are coming up just as I recall this. Like, you know, one is just thinking about milk in general, right? Like, you know, a lot of people struggle with like lactose intolerance, or some people are vegan and they choose not to have any kind of dairy products whatsoever, you know, or, you know, whatever people are on that spectrum, or, you know, whether it's causes more inflammation or them for not. On my father's side of the family, my ancestors have been shepherds, goat and sheep shepherds for a very long time. I don't even know how far back that goes. Even my currently living grandmother is in her 90s and she's still an active shepherdess up in the mountains of Greece right now. But I drank a lot of goat milk growing up. And I notice in myself at different times, in my cycle at different times, when I'm really feeling a strong need for safety and nurturance and security, that because I don't do as well with cow dairy, but that my desire to drink and my need for goat milk, I'm like, I crave it a lot. And throughout this pregnancy, I've just really, really wanted goat milk, like a lot. And so it's just interesting to note too, that like, even, you know, because there are, especially with goat milk, there's a lot of similarities to the composition of human milk, much more so than there is with, you know, cow dairy. But just interesting to note that like there, you know, just like any kind of food that we either have a physical craving for, but sometimes it's an emotional craving, and this food is providing some type of emotional nourishment. But I definitely remember realizing at some point that it was like, oh, certain times of my cycle, or when I'm feeling certain vulnerable ways, like is when this craving for goat milk comes up for me, you know. And that also how I've been trying to get that maternal, you know, nourishment that I was looking for, you know.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And, you know, when you talk about that, it also brings up, for me, there's certain herbs that feel to me when I drink, for example, oat straw tea or chamomile tea. I've done whole periods of time, like I think, you know, like I think I did a 7-day time when I was drinking like half a gallon of chamomile tea a day and have done various things like that, where it felt like there was this mother's milk quality, especially with the chamomile tea. In fact, in some places, like there are some traditions that will put chamomile tea in a baby's bottle to help calm colic, and there's some controversy around that, but because moms will just feed their baby chamomile tea and not give them their breast milk, especially younger moms that are still trying to live their pre-motherhood life. but that there are certain herbs that really have that kind of mothering quality and can satisfy that kind of thing. Do you find yourself craving particular herbs too, or feeling that from herbal infusions as well?
Yeah, I could definitely see that with the chamomile. Motherwort, I know I mentioned that when we were doing our other talk together for the speaker series, but motherwort is one that I feel like really gives that. I mean, it's interesting because I feel like even in the name of some of these herbs, you know, you get that. But yeah, they are allies that are very connected to the, you know, divine feminine in her archetype of mother, you know, and really feel that through them.
Yeah, and even the oat straw, like I loved learning for the first time, and I share this with people all the time, of how you know that oat straw is ready to harvest is you squeeze the little seed pod and out comes this white milk,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's other herbs that have a milky quality that like when you harvest it, when you cut it, for example, wild lettuce
Yep.
is one where if you cut the plant, the leaves or the stalk to harvest the wild lettuce, there's that milky substance. So there's more sources of milk for those vegans out there, is all I'm saying.
Yes, yes,
Is
absolutely.
that we can have that connection to the milk of nature, really, in a variety of different ways that are really powerful. So you also had mentioned before in our comment conversation around this topic that spurred me to invite you to join us on the podcast. You mentioned a variety of other healing practices, because I was asking people what healing practices have you explored to heal the damage that you feel happened for you from not being breastfed. And you listed a long list of healing modalities that
I
you've
could remember what I wrote too. I was definitely sitting there thinking about it for a bit now. Now I'm like, uh-oh, I don't remember all the things coming through.
Well, I'm not testing you. You don't have to, but you mentioned this spontaneous shamanic journey of being breastfed by an ancestor. And you also mentioned, dietary change and herbalism to help heal your gut. I also remember you mentioning somatic healing modalities, and I'm really curious how those may have played a role in some of these in this healing process for you.
Okay, so what's coming up for me as you say that? I mean, I have done a lot of work in terms of working with my own breasts, and so it's interesting. Being pregnant, one of the first things that I've noticed as my body has started to shift actually is I remember being a young girl and seeing my mother's breasts. Like, I'd walk into the bathroom when she was taking a bath or something, and just being like, are my breasts ever going to look that way? And just like, I can so clearly picture my own mother's breasts, and sort of the uniqueness of them. And always kind of having such a fascination with it, and probably even more so for me because the lack of like close familiarity with them. But as my body started to change in this pregnancy, I remember the moment I looked in the mirror and was like, wow, my breasts have become my mother's breasts. Like they have the same look and feel to them as I recall my mom's were. So I'm just bringing that up right now because I think in the work that I've done in terms of healing touch and with myself and like loving healing touch with my own body has been a big part of that. So, in terms of what got me early on into this work was also having a lot of hormonal imbalances. And one of the big symptoms that I struggled with a lot when I was young was having incredibly sore and painful breasts right around menstruation time. And we're often wearing kind of these tighter bras. Maybe at the time, there was a lot of things I didn't understand. I was wearing antiperspirant. I wasn't really allowing for good lymphatic drainage, all these things that were kind of contributing to that. But as I learned more about breast health, it made me really interested to see what kind of practices I could do to kind of support and heal my own breasts. And that felt to me like there is, just in the same way that when we do womb work, we're connecting back to the womb of our mother and the womb of our grandmother. I don't think we necessarily think of the breast in the same way, but there's no reason not to, because this is that ever going fountain, right, of feeding that goes through the lineage as well. A bit of a side note is I did work as a breast thermography technician for a while. So, and I wonder too, just the fact that even came up as an opportunity for me being sort of a part of this is for about a 2-year period. I was working at different integrative medical centers taking infrared photography of women's breasts who were struggling with different conditions, and using that as if you don't know about breast thermography, it is essentially a diagnostic tool that can be used instead of a mammogram. They're different, but oftentimes you can begin to see patterns of imbalance in the breasts or inflammation or something long before the body may begin to grow a tumor or a cyst or some kind of challenge in the breast, as well as be able to see all kinds of things like, you know, a hormone imbalance, estrogen dominance in the breast, things like that. And so interestingly enough, I was doing this work for a while. So it was very much like connecting with women's breasts. So during that time period, I was seeing, oh my gosh, like there's so much that we actually hold in our breasts, and that toxicity can lead to a lot of this pain. And so I started doing a lot of lymphatic drainage techniques on myself. So when you were saying somatic, to me, that's like the actual physical body work that I've been doing with my breasts. And it's a daily practice. I mean, even just, I'm a very bath oriented person. And so I take baths almost every day. And, you know, that's a time where I will apply different oils and I will just do loving breast massage on myself. And, you know, our breasts are energetically aligned with our heart space. Like this is, you know, they're, so to speak, the, you know, the extension of our heart center, which is behind it, you know? So I feel like just like how doing any kind of healing touch on our bodies can be so potent and healing, but specifically being able to do loving work around our breasts is loving our heart center, is loving our heart space, you know? So, you know, anything from like, you know, gua sha related practices to just gentle lymphatic massage to shaking is a very big one. I know women who do suffer from you know, pain and tenderness in the breast, they're like, that sounds horrible, you know, especially when there's a lot of that kind of heavy tenderness, swollen feeling, and the desire to kind of wear a bra to keep everything contained so they don't bounce around and hurt. But what I've ultimately found is that natural movement is so necessary for breast health. And there's a reason why, you know, we need that movement and lymphatic flow in the breast. We don't have, our lymph system doesn't work like our circulatory system. There's not a pump. It requires movement to flow. And so when we wear very tight bras all the time, we don't allow ourselves to breathe very deep and full. That allows for this kind of natural jiggle and movement that, I mean, many women are very ashamed of that natural bouncing and jiggle that happens, you know, but it can actually have a lot of negative effects on our breast health. And so, you know, doing things like bouncing very frequently, you know, and even if at first it can be very kind of uncomfortable or a little painful, the more that one does that, the more they can actually begin to release a lot of stuff that they've been holding there. And I see what I've been holding in my breast in my lifetime to not just be, you know, in physiological and that's the end, you know. To me, it's also kind of part of that connection, my breast being connected to my mother's breast and on going back. So, yeah.
And, you know, shaking itself is there's whole trauma recovery modalities that are just based on shaking.
Right.
There's a whole practice where it's just shaking the body. And that makes tons of sense to me when you start to learn about trauma recovery. You know, I mean, and you think about wild animals not having PTSD because after the hunt they shake it off, right? And we even have that in our language. The term "shake it off"
right
is like that's how we get over a difficult experience, is by shaking it off. And so, and then hearing how this is so helpful to the breasts in this physiological way of getting the lymph to flow and helping to clear out and open up those physical and energetic and emotional channels is so beautiful. So yeah, and I incorporate the shaking practices in my womb dance yoga classes and anything like that. I do a lot of my visionary healing journey work with movement. So instead of having people lie down, they can, but I have people who want to stand up and move the body around and that gives, and people lying down can also shake the body. Lying down is a wonderful way to shake the body too. But shaking is a very regular part of the practices that I share. So I'm so glad to hear you talk about that. So it sounds like the herbalism, the dietary change, the visionary journeying, and then the self-massage and the loving self-touch and the movement orientation, the movement, therapeutic movement, shaking, for example, to be one. Are there any other things, healing approaches that we may not have mentioned?
I mean, I just think that probably the most central one has been continuing to do work on healing and repairing and strengthening the bond between me and my mother.
Mm.
And even a desire to hear more about her connection with her mother. You know, my grandmother's since passed, but you know, as we bring her up and call her in, you know, when we're talking about her and her story, and each opportunity that we get, both my mom and I, to honor her mother, I feel like that work does that. I mean, continuing to be open to that relationship allows that flow of life through our ancestral, you know, just codes to continue to come through us all the time. And so, you know, I feel like that's just kind of probably the most important part for me, is just maintaining that connection with her. And, you know, in many ways with my relationship with my mother, I mean, I know she loves me very, very much. I do know that I probably am the one who makes the more concerted effort for us to communicate. You know, I call her pretty frequently so that we can talk. And I feel like if it was up to her, she probably wouldn't call me as frequently, you know, and that's been part of kind of my own releasing any story around that and fully accepting her for who she is and how she is, but knowing that for her health and my own health, and soon to be the health of this being coming through, that we need to keep that bond very strong, you know? And so just making that a priority, you know, that we are close. She just came out to visit me, and this is the first time that my mom's visited me since I moved out to the West Coast, which was about 4 years ago. And, you know, she's excited. This is going to be her first time being a grandmother. So things are shifting here in that dynamic as well, to see kind of her flourishing in a new role of being about to be a grandmother, me beginning to be a mom, and all of the adjustments that come with that, but really the beautiful developments for growth available. You know, one of the things that I've found as a practice with my mother is just hugging more. Because part of, I think, what was damaged in not breastfeeding is that we didn't have a very physical relationship, just in general. And I don't know this is true for everyone in that, but, you know, my father was much more the kind of cuddly figure in my life, and my mom and I didn't really have a lot of physical touch. And so, you know, it felt uncomfortable. I remember my teen years, I was like, don't hug me, Mom. Like, it just felt weird to me because it wasn't kind of already set as a precedent that we had that type of closeness. And so I remember kind of when I started to try to push past that and be like, I'm going to hug my mom, and we're just going to hug for a while. I'm not even going to let her go, really. We're just going to like stay connected like this for a little bit, you know, and kind of allow myself to push past a little of that discomfort, and probably on her side, some discomfort that was there too, you know, not for any lack of love, but just because it wasn't really what we did in our dynamic, you know? So yeah, I mean, to me, it's like almost more so than any of these other practices or techniques, like doing that. And I would say for people too, whose mothers aren't, you know, still here and embodied, that's still work that can continue on in the spirit realm also. It's just making the concerted effort to honor and make an altar for and connect with. You know, we've got a really beautiful little altar here. I'm planning for a home birth next month, and we built a little altar to my ancestors and my partner's ancestors. You know, we have pictures of our families on there, and, you know, our mothers and our grandmothers, and, you know, having that here and honoring that, I think, is a really important part of doing this work also.
Beautiful. Well, you know, I could talk about these topics all day long, but and I probably am going. I actually am going to, but just in another meeting with other people too. So I would love to invite you to share about, if folks want to get in touch with you. We haven't even shared yet how this is translated into your professional work. But you do work supporting people on with these healing processes as an herbalist and nutritionist. Isn't that right? Correct me.
Yeah. I call myself a hormone coach and a womb alchemist. You know, it's been trying to kind of figure out a word because, you know, we mix a lot of different modalities, right? When we do this kind of work, there's not like a clear paved path ahead of us and a title that we pick up for just that. But yeah, I've mostly been doing coaching with clients one-on-one, and now that I'm transitioning into motherhood, I've been building an online course And so that's really where a lot of my focus is, doing a group coaching program and an online course, but I will still be working with some selective people one-on-one over the next coming months. So yeah, you can find me. I mean, I'm mostly on the social media channels. So it's at womb_alchemist on Instagram and on Facebook. And through there, you can get the links to my websites, to my freebie content, learn a little bit more about what I have to offer, and get on a call with me if you're interested in signing up for my program or doing any coaching.
Awesome. And listeners also know that if you want to learn more about what's on offer at the Womb Centered Healing Temple, you can visit wombcenteredhealing.com. Our next round, our next cohort of the Biomystical Womb Apprenticeship is starting soon. So check it out. There's lots of different options for participating in that. And so wonderful to be with you again, Sabrina, and thanks to the listeners for joining us. That's all for now. Until next time.
Thank you so much.